Hello, welcome to the Bible Standard. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comment section to have your say. We love to hear your thoughts.
This chapter is interesting, 1 Chronicles 13, because, in a sense, it's really a study of contrasts. Because what we've got written up in this story is two men who stood in relation to the Ark of God. But in the one, his association caused death. In the other, the association enriched a man's life. So the breach of Uzzah and the blessing of Obed-Edom were really polar opposites, and yet they're both found in this same chapter. And that can only be really explained by a fundamental difference that they must have had in their attitude. Now, we remember that what happened was that the breach of Uzzah was a tragedy for this reason, that the king had, with every good intention, decided to bring the Ark of God to Zion, dancing and singing and playing with all their might, and suddenly that journey was disrupted and the king was left absolutely afraid. And so in his uncertainty, we know that he took the ark aside, as the record tells us, and he placed it in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, it's been suggested that the term Gittite is a reference to the city of Gath-Rimmon, which was a city of the Levites and of the Kohathites in particular. And some of you, perhaps many of you, will have read J.J. Blunt's Undesigned Scriptural Coincidences, because I certainly remember reading this text, which suggested that therefore the significance of the phrase that that Obed-Edom was a Gittite related to the fact that he was a Kohathite, and that the Kohathites were the ones who should have carried the ark all along. It should never have been taken on a cart in the way that it had been. And because the family of Obed-Edom prospered with the ark in their house, and David had been told that, the inference was that that family had been blessed because they were Kohathites, and they should have been the ones responsible in the first instance. And because later on in the Chronicles record, 2 chapters later, in chapter 15, we find that David will say, "None ought to carry the Ark of God, but the Levites, for them hath Yahweh chosen to carry the ark," that by Levites, David meant Kohathites, and that when David says, "We sought him not after the due order," the connection with Obed-Edom seems to be confirmed, that he was a Kohathite. Well, that's certainly what I thought as well, brothers and sisters, and for many a year. And it was only in looking at it a little more carefully that we believe there is another explanation which in its fullness perhaps provides an even more powerful lesson from this story, and one that we can personally take real encouragement and comfort from. And that interpretation rests on the identification of Obed-Edom as a Gentile and not a Jew, which of course dramatically alters the significance of this passage. Now, there's a reason for so saying that might be the case. In Scripture, there were at least 3 places that were called Gath. There was Gath-Hepher in the tribe of Zebulun, mentioned in the 2nd of Kings chapter 14, verse 25. There was Gath-Rimmon in the tribe of Dan, that was mentioned in Joshua 21, verses 23 and 24. And there was Gath-Philistia in the tribe of Judah, which is mentioned in the 1st of Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. So we do have at least 3 Gaths to choose from as to which one this man Obed-Edom might have come from. And the last of those, Gath-Philistia, is actually the most famous and well-known. So when it comes to describing such an one as Obed-Edom the Gittite, or an inhabitant of Gath, well, it should be the context of the passage that might tell us which particular Gath ought to be referred to. But in every other use of that term in Scripture, the Gittite, it always refers, without exception, to Gath of Philistia, the Gath of the Philistines. There's no other such occasion where it refers to any other Gath than that. Now, let me just go through those with you. We probably shan't turn them up, but if I just give you the reference. In Joshua 13, verse 3, One of the 5 lords of the Philistines is called a Gittite. He can only be that of Gath of Philistia, if he's a Philistine. In the 2nd of Samuel 15, verse 18, it refers to all the Cherethites and the Pelethites, who of course were David's elite troops, which we know were of Philistine descent. And then it mentions side by side with the Cherethites and the Pelethites, it mentions the Gittites that were with those Philistine bodyguards. Well, they were clearly from Gath of Philistia, associated with his Philistine troops. In the 2nd of Samuel chapter 15, verse 19, it refers to Ittai the Gittite, who was one of David's 3 army captains, and we know that he was of Philistine origin, his brethren of Philistines, so he was a man of Gath in Philistia. And in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 21, verse 9, there's a reference to El-Hanan, the son of Jair, who slew Lahmi, who was the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Now, which Gath would Goliath the Gittite come from and his brother Lahmi? They've got to be from Gath in Philistia. Well, that's every other occasion where the word Gittite is used, apart from this one with regard to Obed-Edom. So when it says here in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 13 and verse 13, so David brought not the ark home to himself to the city of David, but carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. When it says here that this man was a Gittite, the weight of scriptural evidence behind that term is that he was by birth a Philistine. And yet it was into the house of this man that David brought the ark in his time of crisis. So obviously David knew Obed-Edom. And it was probably the king's friendship which had led him into the truth. In fact, one of the wonderful things about David, he was thoroughly Abrahamic because his life is filled with examples of Gentiles whom he turned to God and who became in turn his trusted associates. In the 1st of Chronicles chapter 11, among his mighty men, we're told that in the 1st of Chronicles 11 verse 39 was a man called Zelek the Ammonite. He's one of David's men. In the 1st of Chronicles 11 verse 41 is Uriah the Hittite. In the 1st of Chronicles 11 verse 46 is Ithmar the Moabite. These are all David's trusted men. He brought these Gentiles into the covenant hope of Israel. So there was nothing strange in David having a friendship and an association with a man called Obed-Edom the Gittite if he were in fact a Philistine. If you can bring an Ammonite and a Hittite and a Moabite into the company of David's men, you could certainly bring a Gittite. In fact, I think there was a moment in David's life when he might have met Obed-Edom. Because if you come back to the 1st of Samuel, chapter 27, there just happens to be a circumstance in David's life that might provide for such a meeting to have occurred. In the 2nd of Samuel, chapter 27, and reading from verse 2, we read these words. David arose, passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maok, the king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. And then it says, in case we're not sure which Gath is being referred to here, verse 7 says, and the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. So David stayed in Gath of Philistia for more than a year. And we know from another passage that when he left that Gath, 600 Philistines followed him. I think one of them was Obed-Edom. But although Obed-Edom might have come from there, he obviously doesn't live in Gath anymore because Gath is many, many miles away from the road that lies between Kirjath-Jearim and Jerusalem, which is the road that the ark is travelling on in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 13. And so therefore what we learn is that Obed-Edom had left his old way of life down on the Philistine plain. And he's now living up in the hills of the Judean plateau. So coming back to the first of Chronicles in chapter 13, when it says, as it does, in verse 13, so David brought not the ark home to himself to the city of David, but carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, we would be given to understand that Obed-Edom's house now must have been somewhere nearby where the ark had been journeying on this day. See, I think it was providence that the breach of Uzzah occurred at the threshing floor of Kidon, and it was providence that David already knew Obed-Edom as a Gentile proselyte, and it was providence that his house was close to the place where the oxen had stumbled. See, David couldn't just turn aside to lodge the ark at the first house he found. A disaster had occurred. David was fearful of the anger of Yahweh. He couldn't just put the ark anywhere. He was anxious that it be placed into the care of someone who was utterly to be trusted. And it just so happened that right there near at hand was a man he knew personally who was an example of extraordinary faithfulness before God. He might have been a Philistine by birth, but in spirit, this man was an Israelite indeed. Well, we're told in verse 14 of 1st of Chronicles 13, it says, the Ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months. Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. The Chronicles record says the same thing, but slightly differently. Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So here's the question. Why? Why was Obed-Edom and his household blessed? It can't have been simply because the ark came to rest in his house. The mere depositing of the ark wasn't a key to divine blessing. It was his attitude to it. It was his standard of reverence. It was his spirit of devotion. It was his sense of guardianship. This man was so intent on preserving the sacred trust of the ark that he became its protector and its defender, to the delight of Yahweh Elohim of Israel. There was no breach here, not in this place, only a faithful keeping of the threshold of the sanctuary, which for this brief moment resided at his house for the next 3 months. He was blessed because his attitude was right before God. So in what way do we think that Obed-Edom might have been blessed and all that appertained unto him? Well, it would seem, and we'll refer to this a little later, but it would seem that the blessing that came upon him related principally to the increase of his household. Maybe if you hold your hand in Chronicles and come to the 128th Psalm, a famous psalm that you'll know, but I ask you just to read these words in the light of that comment upon Obed-Edom, and we'll defer judgment till a little later whether this seems to be a satisfactory explanation. Psalm 128 says, reading verse 1, notice the word blessed here. Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and his household. Psalm 128 says, verse 1, blessed is everyone that feareth Yahweh, that walketh in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labour of thine hands, happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, thy children like olive plants round about thy table. Behold, that thus shall the man be blessed that feareth Yahweh. Yahweh shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. And the suggestion is that during this moment of time, these 3 months, that in the cycle of 3 moons, there were multiple conceptions that had begun in the household, the wider household of Obed-Edom. In fact, the Samuel record says, it was told King David, saying, Yahweh hath blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that pertained unto him. Now, whether that blessing related to signs of an increasing household, we'll defer to a little later, but I think we have Bible evidence that that was indeed the sign that had been given. And that sign of the blessing of the house of Obed-Edom was the stimulus to faith that David needed to now complete his work. See, David knew how badly he had strayed from the divine standard. He knew that this was something that God would not permit. But the blessing of God upon Obed-Edom told David this, that it wasn't the movement of the ark to Zion that was the problem. That didn't bring divine disapproval. What brought God's disapproval was the manner of its carriage. And now David knows about that. And so the blessing that came upon this household told David that the time was now right to carry the ark, albeit in the correct manner, using the Kohathites, up now to Jerusalem itself. Well, that brings us to the moment of that journey when the ark was successfully brought up. It's a couple of chapters later in Chronicles. If you come to Chronicles chapter 15, we've got the circumstances now of David's second attempt to bring the ark to Zion. And of course, it was an attempt that ended in wonderful success. But let me just draw your attention to some of the people involved in the story. First of Chronicles 15 says in verse 17, so the Levites, and this is under the instruction of David, the Levites appointed Heman the son of Joel and of his brethren, Asaph the son of Berechiah, and the sons of Merari, their brethren, of the sons of Merari, their brethren, Ethan, the son of Cushai. So we've got three men who are appointed to be the leaders of the three singing groups. Heman, which comes from Kohath, Asaph, who comes from Gershom, and Ethan, who comes from Merari, the three great Levitical singing families. And then the record says, verse 18, and with them their brethren of the second degree. Now just stop and think about that for a moment. If they're brethren of the second degree to the singers, and the singers are all Levites, then these brethren of the second degree are Levites as well, but subordinate to the choir leaders. Now, in that group we have this person named, verse 18. Zechariah, Ben, Jaaziel, Shemiramoth, Jehiel, Uni, Eliah, Benaiah, Maaseiah, Mattithiah, Eliphalah, Micniah, and Obed-Edom, and Jeiel the porters. So there's an Obed-Edom, but this man's a Levite. In which case he wouldn't be our man, would he? If our Obed-Edom is a Gittite, then it can't be this one. This is a Levitical man. And in fact, when we come to the 21st verse, it says this, and Mattithiah and Eliphalah and Micniah and Obed-Edom and Jeiel and Azaziah with harps on Sheminith to excel. Now, if you look at the names in verse 17 and 18, verse 18, and then the names again here in verse 21, you'll find that these are all some of those brethren of the second degree. And one of the ones of the second degree who played on a harp before Sheminith to excel, says verse 21, was this Obed-Edom, a Levite of the second degree. So he's playing in one of the musical groups. This is a Levitical Obed-Edom. But when we come to those that were directly around the ark, we notice that verse 23 says, Berechiah and Elkanah were doorkeepers or porters for the ark, and the implication is they were right at the front. Then we've got a list of priests that blew with trumpets before the ark also. But now coming behind, at the end of verse 24 says, and Obed-Edom and Jehiah were also porters or doorkeepers for the ark. So there's two doorkeepers marching in front of the ark and two doorkeepers marching behind the ark. And this is another Obed-Edom, a different Obed-Edom. Can't be the one playing playing on a harp in verse 21. It's got to be another man marching behind the ark. Now, who might this man have been? Well, we suggest the next verse tells us. So David, verse 25, and the elders of Israel and the captains over thousands went up to bring the ark of the covenant of Yahweh out of the house of Obed-Edom. Now, don't you think it would be appropriate for David to salute the integrity and the faithfulness of his friend by asking his friend, a Gentile Obed-Edom, to become one of the porters marching behind the ark as it now comes on a journey from his home all the way now to Jerusalem? This is David's salute to his friend. It's been safely deposited in his house for the last 3 months. I can just imagine David saying, I want you to march behind it as one of the porters who helps take the ark on this day. Not carrying it, but marching as a doorkeeper behind it. And who in Israel would have challenged the presence of Obed-Edom the Gittite as a porter on this day? So do you think it was that man? I do, by the way, but do you think it was that man, Obed-Edom the Gittite, who's the other Obed-Edom here, who marches behind the ark in verse 24, having joined the procession from his own house, verse 25? Well, I think so. And what we do know is that the same Obed-Edom who David asked to march behind the ark into Jerusalem, well, he's mentioned again, you see, in the next chapter. Come and have a look, 1 Chronicles chapter 16. Having got to Jerusalem, it says this, reading from verse 37. It says, so David left there before the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, Asaph and his brethren. Oh, let's just stop there. How many groups of singers were there? 1, 2, 3. Heman, Asaph, Jeduthun. 3 choir groups. But David only leaves one of those choir groups with the ark in Zion. And that's the family of Asaph and his brethren, to minister before the ark continually as every day's work required. But he doesn't just leave one singing family there with the ark, he leaves one set of porters there with the ark as well. And so verse 38 says, and he also left there Obed-Edom with his brethren, says Rotherhams, 68, semicolon, Obed-Edom also the son of Jeduthun and Hosah to be porters, and now we have yet another Obed-Edom who's a different man altogether, Hosah, and they're going to be porters as well, but they will be with Zadok the priest, verse 39, and his brethren the priests before the tabernacle of Yahweh in the high place at Gibeon. So we've got 2 Obed-Edoms in verse 38. One is going to stay with the house of Asaph and the Ark of God at Zion. The second Obed-Edom is going to stay with Zadok and with the tabernacle of Moses at Gibeon. And you notice something interesting about these 2 Obed-Edoms. The second one has got lineage. Obed-Edom, the son of Jeduthun. He's a Levite. But the first Obed-Edom, the one that's going to stay with the ark and stay with the house of Asaph as singers, he's got no lineage. Did you notice that? He's just Obed-Edom. Why has he got no lineage? Well, because he's a Gittite. He doesn't have a family in Israel. He doesn't have any Israelitist lineage to mention. So it's Obed-Edom and his brethren, but he, we believe, is the Gittite, the Philistine, who had only in his lifetime become associated with the people of Israel. But this was the man, remember, chapter 15, chapter 13, this is the man whom David trusted to watch over the ark. So unsurprisingly, when the ark comes to Jerusalem, he says, I want the sons of Asaph to sing before it in Zion, and I'd like that family from Obed-Edom to come and be the doorkeepers there. I trust this man, as well he might have. So David appointed, we believe, Obed-Edom the Gittite to become a gatekeeper and a porter and a guardian of the threshold in safeguarding the ark in its new place in Zion. And there was greater significance to that appointment than we might first realize. Because when you read the 1st of Chronicles 16, you discover that there were 2 tents, 2 tabernacles. One's the tabernacle of Moses in Gibeon, verse 39, and with that tabernacle is the altar of burnt offering and all the vessels of Moses. So says 2nd of Chronicles 5, verse 50. But there's another tent, another tabernacle, which is associated with David in Zion, verse 1, and there'll be a new altar there and also the Ark of God. So 2 tabernacles. The tabernacle in Gibeon stood for the old covenant of the law, and ministering in that place are Heman, the singers of Heman and Jeduthun, and the porters of Kohath and Merari. But the second tabernacle in Zion will stand for the new covenant and the worship of Yahweh in spirit and in truth, and only the singers of the house of Asaph will be there to minister before it in praise. But who will be the porters for that tabernacle of David? Why, the family of Obed-Edom, who alone are left there by David to become the guardians of the threshold in Zion, where the ark now resides. Now, what an honourable, what an exalted position to hold as a Gentile. Now, this episode, as we know, 1 Chronicles 16, well, that happened as first after David brought the ark to Zion. But notice now the arrangements for the temple system that David put in place and finalised shortly before his death. If you come to 1 Chronicles chapter 26, what you may not know is that when we move from the 1 Chronicles 16 to the 1 Chronicles chapter 26, we've only moved 10 chapters in the book, but we've actually jumped 30 years in time. We're now 30 years later. David's now an old man, and he's now setting forth the final arrangements for the temple system of worship that will follow in the temple that Solomon will build for the Ark of the Covenant of the God of Israel. Now, 1 Chronicles 26 is the story of the porters, the final arrangement of the porters for the temple. Not just the tabernacle that David housed the Ark in Zion, now there's going to be a temple arrangement, and there will be porters, and necessarily a lot more of them. Now, this is what it says in 1 Chronicles 26, verse 1. The first group of porters are described this way. Concerning the division of the porters of the Korhites was Meshelemiah, the son of Korah, of the sons of Asaph. And those ones are mentioned through to all the way down to where it says the first set of porters were Kohathites, where finally verse 9 says, and Meshelemiah, that's the one mentioned in verse 1. Meshelemiah, verse 9, had sons and brethren, strong men, 18. So this first set of porters are Kohathites through the line of Korah, as verse 1 says. But there was a second group of porters mentioned in verse 10. And these are described as those of Hosah of the children of Merari. They also had sons. So this is a set of porters who are Merarites through the line of Hosah, and there's no porters mentioned at all, incidentally, in the line of Gershon. Some from Kohath, verse 1, some from Merari, verse 10. Both Levitical groups of porters. But in between those two Levitical groups, there's another set of porters identified, beginning in verse 4. Moreover, the sons of Obed-Edom were Shimei the firstborn, Jehozabad the second, Joah the third, Sakar the fourth, Nethaneel the fifth, Amiel the sixth, Issachar the seventh, Peluthai the eighth, for God blessed him. And unto Shimei his sons were born that ruled throughout the house. And so the record goes on to say, and finally we find that there will be a very large number, verse 8, all these of the sons of Obed-Edom, they and their sons and their brethren, able men for strength for the service, were 62 of Obed-Edom. Did you notice, verse 4, that Obed-Edom is not described in terms of any lineage that he has. He's not a Kohathite, he's not a Merarite, he's not a Gershonite, he doesn't have any Israelitish origin to speak of. He's simply Obed-Edom. This is Obed-Edom the Gittite. This is Obed-Edom the Philistine. This is Obed-Edom the Gentile. And as we read down that list, did you notice those words at the end of verse 5? For God blessed him. Oh, now where have we heard those words before in this story? For God blessed him. That's a direct reference back to the blessing which came upon this man when the Ark of God was in his house for 3 months, don't you think? 1 Chronicles 13, verse 14. And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. And so we know that this is the same man, but we also know in what sense he had been blessed, because his family was marvelously multiplied. Because when we count the sons of Obed-Edom as a set of porters here in the 1 Chronicles chapter 26, his family's by far the biggest. In fact, in this story, in this chapter, out of the 93 men that will be listed for the work of porters, this one family, the house of Obed-Edom, will supply 62 of them. Exactly 2/3. 2/3 of all the porters came from this one man, Obed-Edom. His household was blessed. Blessed indeed. A Philistine family guarded the special holiness of the house of God and the sacred treasure of the ark in its midst. That's astonishing. And all that time, David never forgot the faithfulness of his friend Obed-Edom the Gittite by finally joining him, in effect, to the tribe of Levi, just as Caleb was adopted into the tribe of Judah. David added Obed-Edom the Gittite into the work of the tribe of Levi. They were guardians of the threshold where the Ark of God was. Well, now, why that's interesting is because if you come to the prophecy of Amos, you might recall a prophecy in Amos chapter 9 about events of the future. In Amos chapter 9, we are told this, reading from verse 11, "In that day I'll raise up the tabernacle of David that's fallen." So Amos saw a time when the nation of Israel was going to be rebuilt after the judgments of God had come upon them. Because verse 8, verse 9, verse 10 is all about God judging Israel. But finally, says verse 11 of Amos chapter 9, "I will raise up the tabernacle of David. I'll close up the breaches, raise up his ruins, and build it as in the days of old." So there was going to be a restoration of that order of things that David had established in his day. And in that context of that restoration, the prophet says, "I'll raise up the tabernacle of David," verse 11, "that they," verse 12, "might possess the remnant of Edom and of all the heathen which are called by my name, saith Yahweh that doeth this." That they may possess the remnant of Edom. Now, the margin says, Numbers 24, verse 18, and at first sight that seems to be an appropriate cross-reference because, well, Numbers says, "Edom shall be for a possession, Seir also a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly." But a closer examination of Amos, I think, suggests that this is not the possession of conquest that's being referred to here in Amos 9. It's the possession of conversion. The New King James Version says, "the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name," or literally upon whom my name is called. So this is about Israel reaching out not so much to conquer and to subjugate those who are around her, as to embrace them into the hope of an Israelitish kingdom, because these heathen also would manifest the name of God. In fact, Israel wouldn't do it. It was the work of God, because it says, does it not, at the end of that verse, verse 12, "It is Yahweh that doeth this." Israel will reach out and bring into covenant relationship all those round about them, but they're described as the remnant of Edom. And the cameo of that story of the ingathering of the Gentiles was the story of Obed-Edom himself, who, as the representative of the heathen, became so involved with the tabernacle of David, verse 11, as to be its faithful guardian, and upon whom the name of Yahweh was called to indicate his entire inclusion into the hope of Israel. Now, how better to symbolize Israel's possession of the remnant of Edom than David's acceptance of a man called the servant of Edom, Obed-Edom? Didn't David possess that man in the best of senses? Not by subjugation, but by conversion. He included him into the very work of the holy tribe of the Levites as if he belonged there. Yahweh alone can do this, says the prophet. So the prophecy of Amos, contained within that promise that one day the heathen, the remnant of Edom, will be gathered together into the Israelitish hope, was all outworked in the story of Obed-Edom the Gittite. He was the cameo of that very circumstance taking place, the earnest of it, if you wish. And we have every reason to believe that this is the way Amos should be read, because we have the warrant of New Testament commentary, inspired commentary, that tells us that that is what Amos is teaching. Now, where is that inspired New Testament commentary that would lead us to that conclusion? Well, it's got to be Acts 15, because James, you might remember at the Jerusalem conference, will quote this very chapter from Amos chapter 9. And this is what James says, reading in Acts 15. Just before we start his words in verse 13, you'll remember that what happened. They'd gathered together various delegates from the ecclesias. They of the sect of the Pharisees, verse 5, said it was needful to circumcise them, the heathen. The apostles spoke, Peter spoke, Paul spoke, Barnabas spoke, and finally, now verse 13 says, and after they'd all held their peace, now it says, James answered, saying, men and brethren, hearken unto me. So although all these other brothers had given evidence about how the Gentiles had responded to the call of the truth and how God had been at work in their labours among the Gentiles, it's now going to be left to James to supply a biblical basis to answer the question of the Jerusalem conference about the salvation of the Gentiles. All real to say that they've responded, but have we got a Bible basis for accepting them? Well, that's James's responsibility as the chairman of the meeting. And the clue to his thinking lay in what he says in verse 14. Simeon, he says, hath declared how God at first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And that's the key. A people for his name, says James. And he's now thinking, and he's going to draw attention to 3 Bible passages in rapid succession. Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 and 16. Amos chapter 9, verses 11 to 12. And Isaiah 45, verse 21, which are all connected to the name of Yahweh. But his key quotation will be Amos chapter 9, the one that we've just looked at. So this is how James puts it in Acts 15 and reading from verse 16. To this agree the words of the prophets, verse 15, as it is written, after this I will return, that's Jeremiah 12. And now we're into Amos 9. And I will build again the tabernacle of David which was fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men, that's the remnant of Edom from the days from the wording of Amos, that the residue of men may seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles, upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. And finally he says, known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world, which we believe is an allusion to Isaiah 45, verse 21. Now here's the thing. You see, James saw that whatever final fulfillment there might be that yet lies ahead in the outworking of Amos chapter 9, he saw that there was an immediate and an appropriate application to his own day then and there. This is Amos 9 right now, says James. The question of Gentiles. Amos 9 prophesied that Gentiles would be gathered in. And so the power of Amos lay in declaring that there were Gentiles upon whom the name of God was called, and that therefore it was the sovereign purpose of the Father to call them. There was no better proof. There was no better proof that a Gentile could come under God, was there, than an amazing moment in Israel when a Gittite became a Levite. And what was the question that the Pharisees sought to address in particular in this matter of whether the Gentiles could be accepted? They said it was needful that they must be circumcised. So how powerful, do you think, was James's quotation of Amos 9, when at the heart of that lay the story of the Gentile, Obed-Edom the Gittite, who not only found acceptance at the tabernacle of David, but guarded the thresholds of the ark as an uncircumcised Philistine? Could there have been a better answer to the question as to whether these Gentiles ought to be circumcised? I think the Spirit overshadowed James on that day, and his scriptural testimony convinced the whole assembly he found the right passage. Amos 9 was the perfect answer. And as those who have been called from among the Gentiles, that example of Obed-Edom is wonderfully encouraging, is it not? It's Peter who says in Acts 10, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Gentiles can be included in the hope of Israel if their spirit is right before God. That affects us, brothers and sisters. We're caught up in the reality of this. Their inclusion, the Gentiles' inclusion in God's purpose, is a matter of scriptural prophecy, but also a matter of example as set forth in such an one as Obed-Edom. And what Obed-Edom teaches us is that blessing will come to those who reverence the presence of God in their midst. You can almost feel the spirit of Obed-Edom in the words of this hymn. Wherever, Lord, thy people meet, there they behold thy mercy seat. Where'er they seek thee, thou art found, and every place is hallowed ground. You see, Obed-Edom hallowed his house to receive the Ark of God. By the way, don't you think it must have been an unbelievable moment? Just picture that for the moment. Those precious 3 months. Imagine what it was like inside that house, Obed-Edom's house, for 3 months. Everyone in the family knew that the Ark's right there. Right there. In the lounge. Now, hadn't the Ark of God in earlier times visited several cities of the Philistines and brought smiting and death and terribleness? Wherever it had gone, it had brought nothing other than disaster and destruction. Now it's in Obed-Edom's house. How would you behave? How would you speak? What would you think? You see, in everything they would have been totally conscious of the divine presence for that moment in their home. Or perhaps Obed-Edom becomes a good illustration of how we Gentiles ought to do the same. See, we need to make our homes a little sanctuary for the presence of God. How do we make our homes a sanctuary for Yahweh, the God of Israel? Well, it happens by observing all the little things that make up a godly house and home. That in that house there are prayers every day for help that the purpose of God might be outworked in our lives. Prayers at every meal that we might remember the source of all blessings, including temporal and material gifts. Prayers every day for forgiveness that we might come near the mercy seat and seek its healing power. Prayers in every Gentile house of a Gentile called to the truth. Bible reading every day that we might constantly remember the holiness of God and that we might strive to remove the unholy and the profane from our lives. Bible reading to purify the stream of our thinking so that our perspective remains firmly on the truth. Reminders around our home that this is a house for God. Our books, our quotations, our pictures, our displays should leave anyone that visits our house under no other impression other than we worship the God of Israel and we're privileged to be part of his household. Now, I don't know whether it's the same in Canada as it's been in New Zealand, but I can remember going back to my grandma and grandpa's day that in many a Christadelphian home was a little plaque on the wall that said, Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation. It's almost as if that little plaque was saying, the Ark of God is in this house. Do not forget that it is so. Well, I think that we ought to have that spirit. And as Gentiles, we should never take lightly the principle of how privileged we are to be included in the hope of Israel. We need to treasure that by living lives that declare that God's name has also been called upon us and that we also are associated with the ark of his mercy. So let's be thankful, brothers and sisters and young people, for the story of a man of whom the scripture would say, and Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. Because hiding in that story is one of the most wonderful examples, we believe, of how a Gentile was accepted into covenant relationship with God and lived a life that was thoroughly honourable before him. It's in that spirit that we might understand the words of a hymn that says this, light of them that sit in darkness, rise and shine, thy blessings bring. Light to lighten all the Gentiles, rise with healing in thy wing. To thy brightness, let all kings and nations come.